Hello everyone, welcome to our second UK Squirrel Accord webinar for Red Squirrel Awareness Week and World Animal Day, which is this 4th of October. This morning we heard about red squirrel conservation progress across the UK, and this afternoon we will learn about a variety of different monitoring techniques that can help to support and inform that work. I'm Kay Hoare and I'm joined by Emma Roberts of the University of Galway, Louise Raad of the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and William Cresswell from the University of Bristol. I hope I've said everyone's names right. I will hand over to our first speaker in a moment, but I just want to encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask our speakers any questions, which will be answered in the session following the talks, and do use the chat function for any general discussions amongst yourselves and with the speakers. So that said, I will pass over to Emma to talk to us about hair tubes, wildlife cameras, etc.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen here. Thank you so much, guys, for having me. So my name is Emma Roberts, and I'm a final year PhD student. So I'm just going to be talking today about red squirrel monitoring techniques, but I'm going to be focusing on hair tubes, wildlife or trail cameras, and live trapping as well. So first, just a little bit about myself. My name is Emma, final year PhD student, so catching me in the middle of ride up now, so riding from home, being total hermit. And so I've been using lots of different techniques to monitor red squirrels in urban areas. That's kind of the nature of my project. So before I begin, I'm just going to give you a quick bit of context about red squirrels in Ireland, where I'm doing my research, and the history of the red squirrel. So here is our lovely Eurasian red squirrel. And in Ireland, Ireland is actually the most western region of the red squirrel's distribution range, but they are present all across the Palearctic, from Ireland all the way over to Japan. So here in Ireland, we consider the red squirrel to be our only native species of red squirrel, and they had a horrendous decline after the introduction of the grey squirrel in 1911. So I'm just going to talk about that very quickly. So this dark patch here is the point of introduction, as I said, from 1911. And this man here, Lord Granard of Castle Forbes, took some red squirrels. He received them as a wedding present, and they quickly spread throughout a lot of the eastern part of the island of Ireland. So you can see here from the 2007 Irish Squirrel Survey that their distribution has massively spread throughout a large portion of the island of Ireland. But here, this line, very crudely drawn, represents the River Shannon, which seems to have delineated their distribution as it's acting as an ecological barrier. But it's not particularly that they're not crossing it because they can't swim or anything, because they can. But it seems that the habitat immediately west of the River Shannon is not suitable for the greys, so they just haven't managed to spread. So back then, the news was greys were going up, reds were going down. So it's very sad news for the red squirrel. But then we started to see a population recovery. So this is the same accompanying map of red squirrels from 2007 survey. And if we compare it to the most recent All-Ireland Squirrel and Pine Marten survey, we can see a great increase in red squirrel numbers across the island of Ireland, where they've actually recovered in lots of different areas where they were long absent. So it was looking pretty good for the lovely red squirrel. So this was mainly due to the decline of the invasive grey. And this was actually linked to the resurgence of this fella right here, the pine marten, who is one of our native predators. And when the pine marten became protected in 1976 by the Wildlife Act, grey squirrels started to decline. And this decline, it took a while to be seen because pine marten are very, very slow breeding. And the decline of the grey squirrel wasn't actually seen until more recent surveys. But with that being said, the grey squirrel is still present in very high numbers in Ireland, but particularly in urban areas. So again, this is that map from 2007. Compare that to 2019. And you can see a great decline in the numbers of grey squirrel, but they are very much present in high numbers to the east of the country. And so if we just compare that to the number of pine marten, we can see that there is a negative correlation between the presence of pine marten and the presence of grey squirrel. So not looking good for our invasive friend here. So the recovery of the red squirrel is looking good. It's been attributed to a lot of factors, including the grey squirrel decline, as we talked about, but also due to successful conservation efforts like translocations to the west of Ireland, where there were greys long absent, and also through public awareness campaigns and citizen science. But we are not out of the woods yet, pardon the pun. And this is where I kind of come in, is I'm studying urbanization and the effects of urbanization on red squirrels in Ireland. Urbanization is caused by the expansion of urban areas, and this is bound to increase with the growing human population, which always leads to the expansion of human settlements. And these can have horrible effects for wildlife if they're not managed correctly, and it can lead to habitat fragmentation, ecological corridor disruption, and just an overall loss of habitats. And with grey squirrels occurring in high numbers in urban areas, we're essentially adding on to suitable habitats for invasive species and not looking after our native species. So this is what I do, is I am in Ireland here, but I do a lot of work in the west of Ireland where there are no grey squirrels. And I'm monitoring red squirrels in Galway city in some of the peripheral woodlands, just so we can understand the ability of Irish cities in facilitating red squirrel populations. So how do I monitor the red squirrels, which is what we're all here to talk about. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the difference between non-invasive monitoring and live trapping. So non-invasive monitoring, as the name suggests, is monitoring that doesn't involve you having to get up close and personal with the animals. So this is just things like trail cameras and hair tubes. So these are the first two things that I'm going to talk about. So on the left here, we have a hair tube, and on the right, we have a trail camera. And we can use both of them to measure the presence and absence of red squirrels, but they also have different applications as well. So first, I'm going to talk about hair tubes. I've done a lot of this over my PhD, particularly in urban woodlands, and some of the time they get interfered with, but thankfully, a lot of the time, people tend to leave them alone. So here is a diagram. So it's made up of a number of different components. So the tube itself is pretty simple. It's a piece of PVC piping, kind of the size of a red squirrel. So a red squirrel would have to squeeze through it. And then there is a wooden block on the top that's attached with two metal pins. The hair tube is baited with hazelnuts on the inside and peanuts and maize on the outside to attract the squirrel to the tube. And then the squirrel will squeeze himself through and leave some hairs behind on a sticky substance, which I'll show you in the next slide, that we can then use to identify which species left the hairs behind. So as I said, they can be used to detect presence and absence. But since they are also detecting absence as well as presence, we can also use this to look at red squirrel habitat preferences. So if they're present more so in some areas at certain times of year, or if they tend to avoid certain areas, we can learn that from the application of hair tube surveys. And then also you can use the hairs for genetic analysis if you have the funds to look at the genetics of the red squirrels that leave behind the hairs. So here's another little view of the hair tube, and this is what I mean by the sticky substance. It's just a little, we used cut up glue and that we attached to the top, but there's lots of different, some people like to use double-sided tape. It kind of is trial and error depending on which substance is going to get you the most hairs. But as you can see, the size there is quite narrow, and the squirrel would have to squeeze himself through to get the hazelnuts on the inside. So the size of the tube, they can be used for lots of different mammals, but it would be dependent on the mammal that you're studying. And so then afterwards, you take the hairs back, and the goal is to create some hair casts. So you can go out to the shop, you can get your gelatin solution, just the same that you would use to make trifle. And you create a gelatin solution by dissolving 15 grams of gelatin granules in 100 milliliters of distilled water at 60 degrees Celsius. And so then you apply a thin layer of the solution to a microscope slide, wiping off any excess, and then carefully place each of the hair strands side by side, apply a bit of pressure if you need, and you can do this using a fine forceps. And then you leave the hairs overnight, and the next day you remove them very carefully. And then, so you're not actually examining the actual outline of the hair itself, but you're examining the cast that the hair leaves behind in the gelatin solution. So when you are looking at red squirrels, you are looking for this. So this is V-shaped cuticular scales of the proximal, sorry, I can never say this word, proximal shield of the hair of a red squirrel. But unfortunately, if you're studying an area where gray squirrels are also present, this is also evident in the gray squirrels. So in order to distinguish between red and gray squirrels, a cross-section analysis needs to be carried out. So if you do a cross-section analysis, you have the hair standing upright, you snip them, and then you examine the shape of the hair when you're looking down using the microscope. So for red squirrels, you're looking for this concavo-convex or biconcave shape. And for gray squirrels, you're looking for a kind of circular to oval shape. So here I have a video using our next non-invasive monitoring technique to look at the actual, to demonstrate how the hair tube is actually used. So you can see he is squeezing himself into the hair tube in order to get the hazelnuts inside. And so the size of the tube makes it so the hairs really do get left behind on the top because of how much the squirrel has to squeeze through to get the bait inside. So it's lovely to be able to have the trail cameras to monitor how the squirrels use the tubes as well. And they get kind of frustrated and have to shuffle around a little bit as well. So that video was one of many of the squirrel dancing around on top of the hair tube for a while. Now, to the next slide. Sorry. Is that what happened? So next, I'm going to talk about our next non-invasive monitoring technique, which is trail cameras. So trail cameras are excellent in that they're very enjoyable to use. You get lots of nice footage. And like hair tubes, they also detect the presence of red squirrels, but also the absence of red squirrels, which can also teach us about habitat preferences. But with that, they can also show us certain behaviors exhibited by red squirrels, and that's information that we wouldn't get from the hair tubes. So you can see how they interact with the baited equipment, so hair tubes themselves, or also just live trapping. Sometimes I have to use trail cameras to monitor my live traps as well. If there's something wrong with them or they're not going off properly, I need to see what's going on there. But also you can see like a colleague of mine was examining the behavior of red squirrels around the presence of pine marten. So when the pine marten would show up to the tube, the squirrel would exhibit different behaviors based on the scent of the pine marten. So you can also use the trail cameras to monitor the behavior of the red squirrels as well. And like I said, they're also very enjoyable to use. You can get still images out of them, and you can get a lot of nice animals on around especially when there's bait around. So this is a lovely deer, nice sparrowhawk around one of my traps, and then our friend the pine marten as well, looking around one of those hair tubes. So I use the trail cameras to kind of alongside my hair tubes to see how many visits would result in a positive hit with the hair tubes or a negative one. So it does help to monitor the effectiveness of the tubes in some areas as well. But there's lots of different applications for them. So you can set, depending on what you want to look at, you can have them take still images, or you can also have them record for a certain number of seconds. You can set how many seconds you want to record for. And there's an infrared sensor in front, so the camera only records when there's movement. And so that results in an awful lot of cows for me, because I was working in an agricultural area. So just 100 and something videos of cows. It's horrendous. And an awful lot of jays, because if you're baiting something with hazelnuts and peanuts, the jays are going to show up and leave how many videos, because they'll check every day. So you'll have a great time looking through all of those. So the infrared sensor, you can say how long between each recording. So that's very handy as well if you want to kind of leave it for a minute or two before the next recording begins. And also they have night vision, so you can record in light or dark, and they're also waterproof, so they're perfect for the outside. We use two types. We use Bushnell and Browning. They're both pretty good, but if I had to pick, I would pick Bushnell. And then you can also catch some lovely behaviors like this red squirrel mating chase that I got just before COVID. Oops, I was very happy with that video. And this area where this was recorded is where I began to do the next part of my study, which is the live trapping. So non-invasive monitoring is fantastic for determining population distribution and looking at habitat preferences. But in order to really look at the nitty-gritty of a population, it is kind of crucial to look at the population demographics as well. So that's why I started doing live trapping in Galway, as well as non-invasive monitoring. So there's lots of great uses for live trapping. So you can use it to determine population density estimates, because you can use it for mark and recapture studies. You can also look at individual squirrels' fitness by looking at their weight and their body size. And then you can use that to study the population's fitness. By looking at breeding males and females, you can determine the breeding rate of the population and the survival rate of the population if you're out live trapping for a long time. And then you can also look at behavior by looking at red squirrel vocalizations, like how many alarm calls they make, what kind of reaction they have to the trapping experience each time. And then you can also use it to monitor habitat use as well, if you have your trap set up in numerous areas. So this is a squirrel trap. It is a modified mink trap. It has 2.5 centimeters gap in between each of the mesh, and it operates on a treadle system. So the squirrel goes in to collect the hazelnuts inside and sets off, the weight of the squirrel sets off the trap and closes them inside. So these traps they're basically modified mink traps. They're modified to include a platform on the front and then a nice cozy nest box for the squirrels in the back. So I'm just going to talk through the live trapping procedure. So it's my favorite part of the whole project was doing this, but it goes on for around a week. So the traps need to be pre-baited, which is when the traps are not set, they are baited, but they are not set. And so the squirrels are able to enter the traps without the trap going off. And the how you stop it from going off is you just lock the trap open. So the squirrel gets used to going in and getting bait and retrieving it without getting caught. So it kind of, gets them used to the trap before the trapping actually begins. And so you do that for 1 to 2 days to get them used to it. And then on the morning of trapping, you do the same thing. You bait the trap, except now you are setting it. So you're taking the lock away and keeping it open and set. And so after 4 hours, then the trap is checked and any animals are processed and removed. And then they're locked open until dawn the next day when you're back out again. So when the squirrel is caught, you place a hessian sack around the opening of the trap and get the squirrel inside, and then eventually into a handling cone like you see here. So you then check to see if the squirrel has been tagged before. I'll explain that in a moment using the pit tag scanner. And if it's not been tagged, the squirrel is tagged with a new pit tag and the number is recorded. So the pit tag is placed under the scruff of the neck and pushed into the squirrel's scruff there. And when you hold the scruff of the neck, you can see that the skin is actually very, very loose there. So it's a good place to insert the tag. And so then before you release the squirrel, you record the following. So the trap number, mainly because you want to see what location of the woods it was caught in. The species, sometimes you get lots of different other J's, I'm saying them again, in there. The age of the squirrel, the sex and the breeding status, the weight and the shin bone, because shin bone is a very good representation of overall body size. Whether or not the squirrel had a pit tag, the color of the squirrel, in case if it's molting, it has its summer or winter molt. And then some behavioral characteristics, like how long it took the squirrel to settle in the Haitian sack and how many breaths it takes in 10 seconds. And then you can record any other behavioral traits as well. So the materials you need for this are your pit tag and your pit tag reader. So as you can see, the pit tag is extremely small, and the reader is it's just like scanning something in the supermarket, like it's scanning the barcode in. And then you use a vernier calipers, and it's very accurate to the nearest 0.1 millimeter to measure the shin bone length of the squirrel. Then you use a pistola balance to measure the weight of the squirrel. So with those two measurements, you'll be able to examine squirrel fitness. And then you can use this Eppendorf tube to collect any hairs from the squirrel. Again, you can use this for genetic analysis. So these are the things you do before you release the squirrel. And so then when you're looking at age, sex, and breeding status, but we can't age the squirrel exactly, but we do look at sub-adult and adult squirrels. So for my study, we considered any sub-adult squirrel to be squirrels under 240 grams. And this was determined throughout the study because we could see that the average weight of an adult squirrel was around 350 grams, maximum 400 grams for very heavy or pregnant squirrel. So here we have a little sub-adult squirrel on the left. He was very small. Oh my God, I think he was like 120 grams. And then on the right, we have an adult squirrel. So then if we're looking at breeding status, here's an example of a breeding male squirrel and a lactating female squirrel. So when male squirrels are breeding, they have a staining around the scrotum area. And similarly for females, they have staining around the nipples when they're breeding, and also a lot of balding and swelling around the nipples as well. So that's indicative of suckling young. So there you can determine which males and which females are breeding in the population, and then look at the breeding rate overall. So with that, like, live trapping doesn't always go to plan. This is why the trail cameras do come in handy. So you can see this fella goes in. This is a live set trap. He goes right on the mechanism and nothing happens. So I was wondering why every time I came to this trap, there was no bait in it and no squirrel either. So sometimes what can happen is something can get caught under the trap mechanism, maybe a hazelnut, or maybe even though you might think the trap is working perfectly, there's just something a little bit wrong. So that can affect your trap success, definitely. So in summary, both non-invasive monitoring and live trapping are very, very useful in looking at answering different questions about red squirrels. So for non-invasive monitoring, you can look at red squirrel presence and red squirrel absence, as well as habitat preferences. And if you're using trail cameras, you can also look at behavior. Whereas if you're looking at live trapping, you can examine population densities, individual and population fitness, individual and population behaviors as well, and also the breeding rate and survival rate of a population. So both are extremely useful methods for monitoring red squirrels. And thank you very much for listening. And any questions, I'll take them at the end. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much, Emma. You're obviously doing a lot of work out in the field. It looks brilliant. Fantastic. Okay, if you stop sharing your screen, and then we will pass over to Louise as our second speaker.
I start my introduction. So my name is Louise the Raad. I work for the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust as Head of Research Scotland. Previous to this, I was working for the University of Highlands and Islands at Inverness College. And it was during my employment there that I was working on this red squirrel research. This research was carried out in collaboration with Forestry Land Scotland, and it was focusing on investigating the impact of forest operations on red squirrel population. I'm not quite sure my presentation, what's happening now. I'm going to just try and, right.
Somebody said in the chat that if you're on a multi-screen, what was it?
Are we doing better now?
Setup, you need to select screen with the presentation on it. I think you are on a screen with a presentation on it. It just doesn't seem to be able to want to go to the slideshow version, does it?
Is it on slideshow just now?
No, we can still see the PowerPoint.
Let me just share again.
Just to answer one of the questions that's in the Q&A, asking if the chat and the Q&A are going to be captured on the recording. They will be captured on the recording, and I can make them available if you've got links that you want to publications. Yeah. Oh, that looks great. Thanks, Louise.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So it was my aim to cover a little bit about non-invasive methods dray surveys that we have used, or it's part of the forestry operations, as part of the license conditions. Then Forestry Land Scotland has to carry out these pre-operational dray surveys, and we tested the effectiveness of them. Then I was going to go into trapping, but I can never top Emma's presentation just there. So we will very quickly go through the slides. I just have one video that might be interesting, just to show you that transition from the Hessian sec into the handling code and then release. But apart from that, it is basically I was going to talk through everything that Emma just talked through much better. So we'll do that very quickly. So Emma was just talking there about what you can do, and sort of the methods you can the objectives that you can use that live trapping for. What we did in my study was fitting the squirrels with radio tracking collars. Initially, they were GPS collars. So I'm going to talk a little bit through that and the radio tracking, and then the data analyses that we did for population density estimations very briefly. So in terms of the dray survey, so one of the research questions of the research was to determine how effective pre-operational dray surveys were. So one of the disturbance license conditions that Nature Scot here up in Scotland issues Forestry Land Scotland is that before they are able to start with forestry operations, they need to undertake these dray surveys to identify locations of any drays, and then they need to leave the drays, the trees that have drays in them standing, especially when it's a thinning, but also where possible if it is a clear fell site, usually with a clump of trees around them, where this doesn't pose any wind blow risks. So this is quite intensive. In previous license conditions, there was additionality that if drays were then identified, that they had to establish whether it was a breeding dray or not by sitting underneath this tree for 3 mornings to see whether it was in use and whether there was evidence of breeding in it. This is now no longer the case, but you can imagine that back then that was very labor intensive. So there was no data at the time to look at the effectiveness, and that's where part of the research came in. So just talking about drays, usually these are quite round structures, around 25 to 45 centimeters in diameter. Usually they can be found near the trunk of a tree or in a fork of branches, quite high up in a tree, usually up 6 meters or higher, so they can be quite difficult to detect. The outer layers of a dray are made of twigs. It's really hard to see any entrance hole, like nearly impossible. One of the things we tried to do in the research was use thermal imaging cameras to see whether we could use those from the ground to see whether a dray was in use or not, but that was totally impossible. So, I mean, they're insulated really well. And even if we knew that there were animals in there, then we still couldn't pick that up with a thermal imaging camera. So they're lined with softer material, moss, dried leaves, bark, or grass. And in the summer, when it's warmer, the nest can be more platforms. And there was an assumption that older drays would perhaps be flatter and more spherical rather than sort of the round, fresh-looking structures that you see in the picture. What happened is that one of Forestry Land Scotland's very senior ecologist who was very experienced in doing dray surveys went out into our study site. So here you just see an outline of the forest that was surrounded by open grassland. And he walked transects to identify different drays. He classified them based on what I was just talking about, the roundness and sort of the condition of the dray, but we'll not go into that detail here. Basically, all the red dots and the green squares in this picture are the drays that had been identified during the dray survey. And I can tell you that there were 49 drays in total recorded. Now, the grey triangles are all the drays that we knew from our radio tracking efforts were drays that were in use during our study. So there were 193 dray locations in use, so really a massive amount. Now, that sounds quite bad, obviously, but we have to remember that a dray survey was carried out only over 2 days in this particular year in April, before the forest operation started, whereas the grey triangles on the map that I just shown were recorded over a 9-month period. Those were all the drays that were recorded during our entire study duration. At the time of the dray survey, we had recorded 45 active drays, so we'd only just started our radio tracking. But even of those 45, only 7 of those were recorded by the survey. So even at that point in time, if we didn't look at the rest of the study, suggested that 38 drays, so 85%, had been missed during the survey. So over the entire study period, 171 drays, so that was close to 89% of the total that we recorded, they were not identified, not recorded during the dray survey, suggested that either they were missed or were newly built after the survey was carried out. So our research suggests that the dray surveys are of limited use beyond really establishing the presence of red squirrels, and that they are less useful to confirm red squirrel absence. It also reflects a difficulty in detecting squirrel drays in conifer canopy. This was mainly Scottish pine and Norway spruce, but also the flexible nature of red squirrels' nesting behavior, and that we perhaps don't need to be quite as, well, I don't want to say too precious, but too concerned about protecting the drays. First of all, because we're not very good at it, and second of all, because it seems like they can be quite flexible with their dray use and building. So then I'm going to talk a bit about the trapping, which is the bit I'm going to skip through quite quickly, seeing how Emma covered it really well. So again, here you can see our version of the modified Ming traps with the nest boxes attached. At the back, you can see a hatch that can be lifted up, and the we laid out our traps in about 100-meter spacing from another. Let me just go through my notes to see if there's anything in addition to what Emma said. We attached them to the trees at about 1.5-meter height with the ratchet straps. We also had a pre-baiting period, which involved placing a mixture of nuts and seeds in and on top and everything of the trap. And during this period of pre-baiting, the wooden hatch at the back would be removed and the spring door would just be tied to the top with a zip tie. We again regularly inspected the traps during this pre-baiting period, and we would record whether there were any signs of feeding. I could have put in some photos, but especially with the little maize, with the little corns, you can see the difference between a mouse eating it and a squirrel eating it. And usually if everything was vacated, then you knew that jays and other birds were there and just picking everything off. So we did trapping before forest operations with the aim to mark the squirrels. We used tail marks and later ear marks, which I'll come to in a moment. And then we had another trapping session after the forest operations were completed to retrieve the collars that we fitted. So similarly as what Emma was discussing, we set our traps in the morning before first light, and we closed once trapping had finished in the afternoon. So we just closed them all off, so we didn't keep them open. We normally did 3 trapping rounds per day, one in the morning, afternoon, and late afternoon. Around noon and then late afternoon. So we were timing it so that any squirrels that could be caught wouldn't be in a trap for much more than 2 hours, especially as we were trapping in the breeding season. So I'm also showing you a handling cone there. We kind of, when we started it, we had some help from Mark Ferryman. He's the person in the video that I'll show you in a moment. We had quite a few years of doing trapping at different sites. I think we had 5 sites, 6 sites in total. And the cones originally had a side entrance and a little metal prong at the end. We kind of upgraded that to have a front entrance, front release, so that when you were letting a squirrel out, you only had to lift the door, the front hatch, and the squirrels could run straight out. I think that is already in the video. And then we made new wooden stoppers at the back, which allowed for the tail to come out. In the video I'll show you in a moment, you'll see that Mark's still using sort of an old stopper, though it does have the front release in the handling cone. And Mark's making all the notes himself. We did it as a 2-man process, that we would usually have one person, myself, going around handling the squirrels while other people were scribing, and we really got processing time down to around 2 minutes, 3 minutes at most, so that was as less stressful for the squirrels as possible. And like Emma was saying as well, during handling, when we recorded biometrics and reproductive states of red squirrels, they assess breeding activity and assessing reproductive states, which Emma showed beautiful photos of. So I will leave that. So I'm going to try and play this video now. So this squirrel is already wearing one of the collars, and Mark's just going to remove the collars. This is the end of the first step. See there it's the male breeding condition. Sorry, the video's upside down, my fault. Did obviously hang the squirrel right way around. Here Mark's just checking for any abrasions from the collar. Now he's checking whether the tail mark that was given at the time when we fitted the collar is still present based on the collar number. We knew which individual this was. Okay. Okay, so you could hear Mark talking about the different, like the tail mark that we were looking at. So what we had is these, as you can see on this photo, we had A, B, C, D up till E. So each squirrel would be given a unique tail mark just by trimming the fur. And with this schedule, we could create up to 18 male and 18 female unique marks. And then later on in our study, we used ear tags. These national band ear tags, they're size 1, so the smallest for little mice, and they had numbers engraved in them for individual identification. So we had a special applicator using them. So juveniles or adults that were too small to be fitted with a collar, they would still get an ear mark, which was really useful for our survival analyses. So then you could see some of the colours that Mark was taking off. Now we've gone through with this study, which started back in 2015, really. First, Mark had colours that were kind of like homemade colours, and then we used a company run by Ian Holbert. I think it was called Scorpa at the time. They all malfunctioned, and we had very bad experience with these GPS collars. They were also quite heavy, probably a bit heavier than I would have liked to have used. The downside of all of the collars that we used was obviously because they had to be quite lightweight, was that they would store the data on the collar, which means that you don't know how well they worked until you retrieve them. So the first time when we had put them on the squirrels, we didn't get a lot of data back because a lot of them had malfunctions. So this was a big problem. We then went with these G10 ultralight tags from Advanced Telemetry Systems, and we set the GPS at various intervals. So the sampling interval was designed to extend battery life whilst ensuring that the data captured during sort of what was identified as peak activity times was sufficient. So the expected battery life under those settings was 185 days. And like I said, the collar had to be retrieved to download the data. When we put these ATS collars on, we'd already experienced that GPS malfunction during the previous phase of the study. So we also carried out radio tracking. This was back in 2017, sort of between February and September time, just to ensure that we obtain sufficient locational data for our analysis, which I'll come to in a moment. So with the GPS data, if the GPS has worked, here you can see an example of the data that you get back. So this was for male 12, and we had 77 days of data before the collar malfunctioned. This was data collected every 15 minutes during the day and once hourly at night time. And what happened with these collars is that they took 3 readings, so 3 snapshots of a location, and then those 3 locations would be averaged. So you can quite clearly see sort of the range of the squirrel, and then also how it's being open areas and dispersing to use other habitats alongside the river at certain times a year. And it was really interesting to see that this coincided, well, maybe unsurprisingly, with deciduous trees producing seeds and hazel availability along the river. So the GPS collars, when they work, they're amazing. Unfortunately, the majority of the time, in our experience, they didn't work, which is why we resorted to radio tracking. And later on in the study, we went to purely VHF only collars. So that was really to benefit the squirrels if we were going to do all the radio tracking. The VHF, as you can see on the right as well, it's much smaller and much lighter. So we used two different models of these VHF collars. We had the ATS one, M1550 on the left-hand side, and then from Low-Tech, the PIP3 long life tags on the right-hand side. So the tags are coated with epoxy to make them waterproof, and they were attached to the neck of the squirrel using a cable tie. And obviously they're covered in PVC tubing on the left-hand side in the photo. But then the Low-Tech collars were shrink wrapped to minimize the comfort, so that was really good. Slight downside is that if you didn't put them on right, so I mean, when you put them on, you're really carefully tightening them, but in case it was too tight, you'd have to cut them off, and then the PIP3 had to be refurbished because you couldn't replace the cable tie because they were shrink wrapped. Excuse me. The VHF whip antenna protrudes through the PVC tube at the back of the neck of the squirrel, so that sticks out into the air. Although we often found that these get nibbled off, either by conspecifics or maybe it can grab it, but often they were quite short. But regardless, the VHF, like the radio signal we got off them, was still quite good. When we first started using the GPS collars, they had patch antennas instead of whip antennas, but they performed much worse than the whip antennas did, even the whip antennas that were trued off. So I wouldn't recommend that. So the total weight of these VHF collars was 7 to 8 grams, and the battery life of the transmitter was estimated to be around 190 days. We didn't put any collars on squirrels that weighed less than 280 grams. There isn't much scientific literature or science on, the weight of collars. Sometimes they use arbitrary rules of 5% of body weight or 3% of body weight, but that was our cutoff. So after trapping, we'd go out with our receiver and a big Yagi antenna to track the squirrels. So fixes were taken up to 3 times a day for each individual squirrel, with a minimum duration of 2 hours between consecutive fixes to ensure independence of data points, although it's a bit of a red herring, and you can now model things even if data are dependent, the same as GPS data. The fixes were recorded using a mobile phone app. We used Survey 123, which works really well, and it doesn't require mobile phone reception or internet, and it saves having lots of paper trail that then needs to be inputted with all sorts of potential errors. So red squirrels were tracked until either the animal was sighted or the tree in which it was located was quite clearly identified, and their locations, so the waypoints, they were recorded using a handheld GPS Garmin model as a GPS MAP 60 CSX that we used. For each waypoint, we recorded whether the animal was active, so we did that if the squirrel was being seen, whether it was in a dray, if we could observe a dray, or whether it was unknown. So we had a clear signal. We knew it had to be in a tree somewhere, but we couldn't really see a squirrel or a dray. So the signal that's emitted from the collars that allows the direction and approximate distance of a squirrel to be determined, so the team can then gradually close in on it. And because the squirrels could end up several kilometers away, they can cross open fields, roads. We've even seen them cross Bintorn River, which is quite a substantial river in places. They're able to travel long distances, even in just a few hours. So sometimes we had to use an omnidirectional antenna on a car to trace any squirrels who've wandered off very far, especially if we had to still retrieve the collar. So we used both omnidirectional antennas and the Yagi antennas for radio tracking. So here's just an example of radio tracking data of 5 females and 6 males in a forest on the Black Isle in Scotland. and by inputting the data into ArcGIS, into this survey 123, it actually gives you live updates as data has been put in, or at least once the person is back into 4G reception or internet reception. So you don't need any 3G or 4G while you're doing your data collection, but then it will download once you're in that area again. So it's quite nice to see the data come in if other people are just behind their desk working away. And then finally, I said at the start, we did our trapping over 2 periods. We did that to obviously retrieve the collars, fit the collars and retrieve the collars. But then we obtained a population density estimation based on our trapping data before and after forest operations and compared those to one. So we used maximum likelihood estimation of spatially explicit capture-recapture analyses in our software using the SACR package. We've published these methods, and there's more detail in the supplemental information if anybody's interested in sort of the detail how we've done that. But we considered sex differences and a behavioral response to trapping in our models, and you need to use a habitat mask. And we used the information that we gathered with the tracking on home range sizes to create a mask which was used as a buffer around our traps. So that was it. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Louise. I've never seen that done with the sack and getting the squirrel and how you work that. So that was brilliant. Thank you. Great. So we'll move on to William, who is going to discuss a very new technique.
Amazing. Okay, so I'm Will. I'm a PhD student at the Uni of Bristol, and I'm studying a project around bioacoustics and how that can be used as a survey and monitoring tool for red squirrels. So this, obviously, I imagine everyone here will kind of know this. Red squirrels are the UK's native squirrel species. Invasive grey squirrels were introduced from America in the 1890s. They outcompete reds through resource exploitation and disease-mediated competition because they're vectors of squirrelpox. And recently, in the Mammal Society's red list for British mammals, they're classified as endangered. So obviously, conservation action needs to be taken, and that's why everyone is here today. There are a few kind of traditional survey methods we've all been hearing about them today, and other ones. It's kind of visual surveys, hair tube surveys, dray counting, feeding sign surveys, and whole maze bait. These all kind of have their own advantages and disadvantages. A big one for these kind of bottom three, the dray counting and down, is that in areas where red and greys overlap, it's hard to really distinguish between what evidence of which of the two species you're seeing. So in areas like where we're studying, where the two are overlapping, then less useful. And things like visual surveys and head tube surveys can obviously be very labor intensive and somewhat require a kind of expert observer. That's why I think most kind of real world long-term monitoring in these areas relies on camera traps and feeding stations. These are kind of a bit better in terms of efficiency and kind of labor intensity. It's a very approachable technique because you don't have to be an expert to see the pictures and see what's a grey, what's a red, what you kind of have there. And because of how cheap the kind of technology is now, you can buy camera traps for not a lot of money, and it's very approachable technique. But it does still have some kind of drawbacks. One being that camera traps are quite power and data hungry. They get through batteries quite quickly and fill up SD cards. And the other thing being is that they require bait really, because the field of view of a camera trap's obviously not massive. You kind of need to artificially draw squirrels into that area. And so if you're long-term monitoring a site, where we have, for example, sites in England where they're kind of red squirrel strongholds under a pretty constant threat from greys. If you're constantly allowing them to have this supplementary feeding, they can kind of develop reliance on it. And yeah. And the other issue is what you see in this photo. This is from our site in the Lake District. Feeding stations are lowering both species to a kind of shared food resource, which is obviously a pretty significant disease spread risk if you're just kind of encouraging this close contact like in this picture. There's ways to mitigate this. I think the best practice is to spray down the feeder with veterinary disinfectant in between refills. But obviously, if they're coming close to this, sharing food, it's a disease at risk. So that's where kind of bioacoustics could come in as a useful new methodology. Bioacoustics for survey monitoring is essentially you just record the soundscape and use that to infer presence or absence based on whether you can hear your target species calls in that soundscape. The kind of benefits of this is it's a completely non-invasive monitoring technique. You can just put a microphone out and just listen to the soundscape. The recorders are also very cheap. We use mostly these audio moths, which are pictured below. They're kind of open source audio recorder developed in the UK. It's just a printed PCB board that you can either attach AA batteries or a kind of lithium battery pack, and it will just, you program the recording schedule and you can just leave it to record. It basically will go until you fill your SD card up because it doesn't take a lot of power. There's a lot of scope for automation, which I'll get to later in the kind of acoustic monitoring, and a big advantage is bycatch. So for example, I'm collecting all these soundscape recordings to kind of look out for grey squirrel invasions and monitor the reds. But if another researcher was interested in, say, sparrowhawks on site, they could use the exact same database, but for their own research or for their own surveys. But what bioacoustics requires is a vocal organism, obviously, and a good understanding of your target organism's vocal behavior, and for those vocalizations to be distinct from other species, so you can obviously tell them apart. So for squirrels, you need to know that they're two vocally distinct species, and that's kind of first question everyone has, but it is they are very vocally distinct. Grey squirrels, it's ideal because it's a very well-studied part of the literature. There's a researcher called Robert Lyshak who did a lot of research into grey squirrel call behavior, and so that's a really helpful starting point there. All grey squirrel calls are made up of 4 notes: cut, quah, buzz, and moan. You can see on the spectrogram there a series of these cut calls followed by 2 quahs at the end. There's those are kind of used in different orders and tied in with there's tail movements and different kind of inflections like that where they can use, and that's how they distinguish their behavioral context. So alarm calls, competition, mating, and stuff. I'll play a little sound. I'm sure everyone will recognize what they're doing. Yeah, there's 2 longer notes at the end there. I hope that came through. And then we get on to red squirrels. Red squirrel vocalizations are much less studied part of the literature. There are no published spectrograms out there on their kind of call library, but there are some qualitative descriptions, such as this one from Eibel Ebersfeld, who's a famous ethologist, but he published a paper on red squirrel communication or red squirrel development just because he raised 2 baby red squirrels. They're often incorrectly assumed to be non-vocal because of how timid they are, or mistakenly assumed to call the same as greys, like in this paper on squirrel communication. So the kind of first step in our project is to put together a library of the red call types we can identify. We did this using captive reds at the British Wildlife Centre and using recordings out in the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales. Their main they do a highly varied chatter call, which is made up of these 2 notes that you see in the spectrogram. The low low aspect, like a whir. That was where most of the vocal energy is, which is why it's more dark in the, or more red in the spectrogram, and then a high squeak as well. It's that kind of half dome shaped part. And then they also have a chuck call, which is their kind of alarm call, which is louder and carries further. A muck muck call, and an interesting mew call that is we've only seen a couple of examples of. All sound very distinct from greys. I'll play the red squirrel call now. So came through. And then this is just a little bit on how we set up these audio moths, because just to show how kind of simple they are as a recorder. There's, if you plug it into your computer, and then you can use the configurator app they've got. And here you just set the recording schedule, so a time for the recording to start and the recording to stop. You can set the more kind of advanced details like sample rate and gain, things like that. Obviously lower sample rate, the kind of less large the files are. So if you're looking at something very low frequency, you can save a bit of file size there. You set your sleep duration, because they can't record continuously. They make, so the usual is to set 55 seconds of recording and then 5 seconds between. So it records 55 seconds of every minute. And so you lose 5 seconds per minute. But then you flash these settings onto the recorder. And then when it's deployed, it will just follow these instructions until the battery dies or the SD card fills up. With the schedule I set, which is about dawn till dusk, and the batteries we use, we can go for about a month and a half maximum of just leaving it alone to record. Obviously, you might want to check your data more regularly than that, though. And then to find the vocalizations, primarily I use something called pattern matching, which is a tool that you can use on Arbamon. Arbamon's a bioacoustic analysis software that is kind of developed by one of my funders, Rainforest Connection. It's an open source software that you upload your recordings to in the cloud, and then you can use tools on there. Kind of, it's a browser-based software where you can analyze it, go through. So this is an example pattern match of looking for a gray squirrel call. This is set to a very low threshold. So basically a pattern match uses a single example of your target signal that you give it. So once you've found one example of the call, you can set that as a template. So that's what I've done with this call here. This is one gray squirrel quail call. You set that as a template, and it will search an audio playlist you give it for segments of audio that match this template to a specific correlation threshold that you set. So the threshold set very low for this search. So you can see that's why it's put out so many matches. But then I only validated up to, I think, about 0.6 threshold. And so that gave me 56 presences and 144, which were false positives at that threshold. So that's a good way, rather than manually searching through every single minute of recording you have, you can quickly search using tools like this. And like I said, Opmon's completely free to use, which is a big advantage. There's other programs like Kaleidoscope that are also very good, but I think you need to pay for the better features on those. So then we get onto testing our methodology against your kind of traditional camera trapping. So we're doing this using a paired design where we've got at each site a camera trap, a feeder, and an audio moth, and kind of comparing them on two main measures of latency to initial detection and probability of detection. So that's how long it takes to detect your species and how many like the probability of detection is out of how many surveying days you got positive confirmation that they're there. And then also we're comparing on grey squirrel invasion events detected. So at our site in the Lake District, there was a lapse in grey squirrel control on site because of the landowners having issues getting grants to fund grey squirrel control. As a result, we saw quite a few grey squirrel invasions. And so it was actually quite useful to test how they compare there. Feeding state, we're also comparing feeding stations with and without bait to see how using bait affects each methodology. We're still collecting data to form a big data set continuous monitoring, so we've not carried out formal statistical analysis yet, but the trends are already there to be seen. In general, a baited camera trap is the most efficient methodology in terms of that is how you seem to get the lowest latencies and the highest probabilities of detection, which is kind of what you'd expect if you're, bringing them to a specific area. You're more likely to see them, and quite often there'll be kind of a one squirrel that can go to a feeder, feed and leave, and it doesn't need to be vocal there. So obviously the bioacoustic won't pick it up, whereas a cam trap will. Bait increases the efficiency of both methodologies. So a baited feeder makes reds more likely to vocalize as well, or at least that's what the trend looks like right now. And acoustic monitoring is less impacted by lack of bait. So not having bait will impact the feeder more, which obviously makes sense because, the range of your camera trap is your field of view. And if they're not actively drawn into the field of view, then you're not likely to see them. Whereas, especially for louder calls, like the loud grey calls, the range that audio recorder will hear it is much larger. And both methodologies have successfully detected grey squirrel invasions on the site. So they're both doing their job in that regard. A big kind of way to streamline that analysis is using AI models. Even using pattern matching is quite time consuming, especially if you're working on a larger project or if you have a lot more recorders out. That label will still add up and take up more of your time. So a big benefit would be able to automate that analysis. So we're developing a convolutional neural network, a CNN, that will automatically extract instances of these vocalizations. The way this model is trained is you give it a large data set of labeled data. So I've already gone through and labeled which ones are true positive, which ones are false positives for grey squirrel calls. So here is a diagram showing that kind of workflow. You upload recordings, make a template, use pattern match to find instances, and then you label all that data. Then those examples are broken up into segments and train the CNN. And then when the CNN is going through, you can see at the bottom of the diagram, it breaks up your audio in segments, and it gives a prediction of how likely it is that those features match with what it's looking for. And so then it will give out an output of where they are, where it's extracted positive instances of either of those calls, and then you can go through and manually validate. And yeah. So our success with that so far, we've trained trained an AI with a data set of labeled recordings using about 500 true positives and 1,000 false positives for each call types. And for the model, we used 2 common grey calls and 2 common red calls. A confidence of 0.8, all the true positives were found in our test data with an 82% true positive rates for the reds and 62s for the greys. The grey calls can be a bit more difficult for the AI model to pick up on. It's quite a broad band call, that quar call, which is their most common, and so it's a little bit harder to identify. So we're doing retraining at the moment to kind of increase that accuracy and reduce the amount of false positives we're getting. When the AI model is fully trained, it will be made open source, so Upmon users can use it, and I think it will be published on GitHub as well, so it can be run on other software like Kaleidoscope. And that kind of leads us into the idea of completely automatic monitoring. So Rainforest Connection, come in the way here, so let you see that. Rainforest Connection developed these automatic recorders that to combat illegal logging in the Amazon. So their job, rather than to listen out for a certain species call, is to listen out for chainsaw noise. And they've developed AI models to help detect chainsaw noise. And so we're trying to use those same principles in monitoring for grey squirrels in red squirrel strongholds. So they're solar powered. You can see the kind of flower shaped solar panel array at the top. And then it's essentially a phone on the inside with a external microphone. And so it's connected to the 3G network. It can upload your recordings as they are recorded, and then and keep it self-charged. So you don't need to keep visiting the site, changing batteries and SD cards. Once the data's in the cloud, the AI model will be able to go through it and extract where there are reds and grey calls in the data. And then the aim is to have that be able to initiate a completely automatic response. So once the data's uploaded, the AI model goes through it, and then if it finds a grey squirrel, it can send a text or email alert to the local conservation body and say, there's a grey squirrel detected at this site at this time. And so that kind of instantaneous response is the really big benefit of this approach, rather than if you're visiting the site every 2 weeks or every month to check your camera trap, you might see that the day after you set it last, a grey squirrel came onto the camera, and it's so you're 2 weeks behind being able to respond to that. Whereas kind of having an instant response like this would be the kind of ideal there. So yeah. I'm at the slides. Oh no, I'm not. You can read a little bit more about our project and other projects that Rainforest Connection has worked on, because they recently put out this publication at this link here. It's a good read, interesting. And yeah, can't skip through. Thanks for listening.
That's great. Thanks very much, Will, and could make a real difference to finding out when, being able to identify when grey squirrels are really kind of first moving into an area, rather than, as you say, that kind of eventually when you get a visual sighting. Fantastic. Okay, so we'll move on to the question answer session. I'll just go through them as they've been put. There's one for Emma to start with. Have you compared diagnosing red squirrels and grey squirrels by looking at the hairs under the microscope, and what's the kind of more the benefit of using the gelatin method instead?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can look at the hairs under the microscope, but just they don't really look too different. When you look at them, just the actual outside of the hair, you'll just get kind of a color that can help to identify or give you an idea maybe of what species it is, but it won't tell you what the actual species. It won't identify it down to the species level at all. And the only way to do that is by looking at the casts left by the guard hairs in the gel. So I get what you're saying. Like if you see a kind of reddish tint, or look at the pattern of a hair of a red squirrel, you might be able to assume it is, but you can't say scientifically that it is. And also you do get red squirrels that have grey fur at certain types of year, and grey squirrels that have kind of chestnut fur at certain types of year. So you really couldn't identify it down to the species level at all without using the methods. And I just see that other question under that is where I got the methods from, and they're definitely not for me at all. It's a method by T-Rink. It's the hair of West European mammals. And that was a book from 1991, and it's where we got all of our information. And they have all of the info about the different casts left behind as well. So I recommend looking at that if you want any more information.
So is it a technique that's used for many species?
Yes, loads of species. And also, even though I'm only looking at red squirrel hair, I could have pine marten hair inside in the hair tube as well. And I just wouldn't be able to identify that down to the species level without making the casts.
Brilliant, thank you. This question, do you ever use standard feeders with sticky pads rather than using the hair tubes?
No, actually, never. I don't really know why it probably is just to do with the access to the equipment that we had. We had access to a lot of hair tubes in our lab. But that being said, I'm sure that you could collect hairs that way, but I'm just not sure if it would be as specific to one species like it is for the squirrels, because just because of the size of the opening, I very, very rarely get species that aren't squirrels inside, and it's, I feel like with a feeder you'll have lots of different animals running all over, so you might be all day trying to distinguish the hairs from one another, but that could be a good way to do it as well,
but making it harder for yourself maybe at the same time.
Yeah.
Emma Sheehy asks, great talk, Emma. Are you finding many urban or suburban populations of red squirrels in Galway, and have you been able to compare them to their rural counterparts?
Yes, so we have been, so in Galway now we have a kind of interesting situation where we have two core populations, and there seems to be established red squirrel populations in two urban woodlands in Galway, but they're not meeting each other, so they seem to be quite isolated. And in terms of the density of the squirrels, I've only been able to carry out live trapping in one just for the safety of the squirrels, because it's on private, it's a kind of a private area. So in that area, the density is it's much lower than you would get in rural woodlands because it's very fragmented and it's not particularly large, but it's still better than we would expect. So, but in comparing it to rural populations of red squirrels, there's definitely a higher potential for them to grow in kind of a more ideal woodland, like where I'm working isn't perfect for them at all.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions to Louise. I know you've been answering yours online, haven't you, Louise? Which is great. But I'll just ask them just so others know. Did you see any difference with dispersal range with collars fitted between male and female squirrels? And then another one, which kind of, what is the furthest range that a squirrel was found to have travelled during your monitoring?
Yeah, no, those were great questions. Although we didn't look at dispersal as such, so we retrapped after the breeding season. We found no significant differences in home range during our study between males and females. We did find some females and males who would wander off quite far, probably either for food availability or males chasing females to look for breeding opportunities. So male, we had about 3.5 kilometers from the study site, and we've had a female disperse. I think I said 5. I looked it up. Around 5 kilometers, even 5.25 kilometers. So quite far. Like I said, over open terrain, and we had some forest blocks that were really isolated that were due for clear fell, and even before they were clear felled, even before the forest operation even started, we saw that really large dispersal over vast open terrain. So that was showing that even without the pressure of forest operations, squirrels were quite capable and naturally disperse that sort of distances.
So is that a normal, crossing open spaces? Is that quite normal behaviour for the red squirrels?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, obviously their home range is within a woodlands, but
yeah, to
access other areas, they seem perfectly capable of crossing open terrain to some extent.
Great. Question, what is the best or most reliable way to sex a squirrel if you're not going to handle it?
Yeah, I said impossible, but happy for other people who are either participants or for the other presenters to say something different. If you have really good binoculars, you might be able to see nipples in a certain position, or
I would agree with that as well. Yeah, I'd say it's very, very hard otherwise, unless you just get really lucky with your binoculars and get a really good view of something. But other than that, sometimes I can barely tell when they're in the cone.
Yeah. I mean, you see the occasional photograph with a really high, power lens, and you can see sometimes the genitalia or the nipples or something on that, but it's not a common sight.
Yeah.
No, it wouldn't be a systematic way for any scientific study to do it that way. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. There's a question: do you need a license to live trap and handle red squirrels?
Yes, you do. So I work up in Scotland, so we need a license from Nature Scots, a disturbance license, and depending on what type of things you're doing to the squirrels or what kind of data you're getting off the squirrels, you might need a Home Office license as well. So the work that we've been doing hasn't required a Home Office license. When you're marking squirrels for identification, you don't need a Home Office license. Natural England will provide licenses down south the border, and whether you would require a Home Office license would depend, like I said, on the type of work you're doing. If you're putting things under the skin or if you're taking certain swabs for DNA analyses, then it's different. If you're doing things for individual marking, then you can get away without the Home Office license. So if you take hair samples, but you do it for marking, then you don't need a Home Office license. But if you did it for DNA analysis, then you wouldn't need a license. So you'd need to be a bit careful with how you phrase things.
Check first.
Definitely check first, but the Home Office is great and they're very supportive, and yeah, they'll give you advice on whether you would or not require that. And yeah, ethical approval is also often required depending on who or where you work for, whether it's a university or, in my case, GWCT. There'll be usually be some type of ethics committee that you need to go through in addition to the licenses you require.
Yeah, and that's a similar case in Northern Ireland, I'm assuming, Emma.
In the Republic, it's you have to go by no worries. You have to go by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Just our university requires that for us to go out and do any live trapping, and then also so we have to get a license from them, and then in order to carry out a procedure, we have to do a course with Last Ireland, which is actually for laboratory animals, but it also covers wildlife, and just to get a license for that. So, and to do that, you have to do a course as well. So yeah, it was just a little bit of but it was great to learn anyway. But it was you had to just take a little bit of time out to do that before we could go out and do any trapping.
Yeah. So in Scotland, you don't need a specific training, but the disturbance license will be held by somebody who's very experienced, and they can then train up any people underneath them, and it's up to them to say, okay, I've seen you handle enough squirrels and do this work that we're requiring you to do before somebody is allowed to do it independently. So then it's just a matter of having somebody experienced available on your team to be the license holder. And then if you don't have that experience, for you to then get trained up, and then after you can say, I've handled this many squirrels independently, and then you might be able to be a license holder yourself in subsequent projects or years.
It's great to ensure the safety of the red squirrel, definitely.
Definitely, and even with lots of experience, things can go wrong. So it's really important to, take your time and.
They're very quick, aren't they? Great. We've got a few questions for Will. Have you found any evidence that grey squirrels will use vocalizations even if there are no conspecifics around? So no animals of the same species.
Yeah. That is an interesting one, because obviously if you've got one transient grey coming into a red stronghold, are they going to be vocalizing if they don't think there's other conspecifics around? From what we've seen, they can do. I definitely think as soon as there's two greys, they can become very vocal to each other, especially at this time of year and stuff. We've seen a grey come into our stronghold we're working at and start vocalizing. Don't know if that's a kind of, to find out if there are other conspecifics around, or there's alarm calls that they kind of will instinctually do just in the presence of a predator or something. So yeah, I not definitive, but I think they do, but definitely at a lower rate.
I mean, I've definitely seen grey squirrels alarm calling when there's been like a bird of prey, or there's been a dog around, or even just, you know, a human that they're not very keen on, or yeah. But I don't know about the chattering, you know, that would maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Ryan says, fascinating study. Will, can you broadcast squirrel calls of either species to elicit a response?
Yeah, that's something we're doing at the moment. Is we're doing playbacks where I'll be sat in a little camo hide thing, waiting for red squirrels to come to feed her, and I'll be playing calls to them. It's mostly we're trying to understand some of the behavioral contexts where the calls are used. So playing at them and kind of seeing their response, and playing some red calls, playing grey calls, seeing how they respond to each of those. They're not hugely responsive to any of the calls so far. There's a red squirrel alarm call that we know is an alarm call, and that is the one where that was just send them back up the tree. But other than that, there's not a kind of call and response element, which is something we're hoping for.
Is that because they know there's no squirrel there, or is it?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because I think when all the recordings we're playing back are ones we've recorded, and obviously you lose quality along the way, and then you kind of have to process them before you play them back to kind of remove awkward background noise and like taper the sound in and taper it off at the end. But yeah, it's either not passing the realness test for them, or they're not really interested in responding so far.
Have you used these recordings or these devices that in urban settings, and would background traffic noise be problematic?
Yeah, we've used most of the grey calls that I've collected around Bristol. So that's all obviously very urban, a lot of background noise. It doesn't really affect the recordings too much. There's quite a high level of background noise in the Lake District as well, just because of wind. It's so windy up on site that really, like, with it's the microphone doesn't have like a big foam baffle, so it does pick up wind noise, and that can affect it just as much as cars going by. What it can affect is the AI model, which is we trained it on natural recordings, so human speech can confuse it a little bit, and so I think a bit of retraining with some busy human sounds might help that. But yeah, it's not too much if you're manually going through.
Yeah, great. Have you tried using a better quality sound detector, such as a wildlife acoustics song meter mini, to see if a sound file recorded for a grey squirrel is easier to detect?
Yeah. We haven't actually used the song meters, but it does. The audio moth is surprisingly quite good quality, even though, because it's just like a circuit board, you have to have it in a waterproof bag. And so we're worried for a while about how the bag will affect the sound quality and the transmission through it, but it only really affects the higher frequencies, and squirrels are obviously vocalizing right in our audible range where it doesn't have a huge impact. The automatic detectors we have, because they have to send the data over 3G and stuff, they sample that the recording quality is purposefully very low. So I think the performance of those would be improved with higher quality, but with higher quality, you need better bandwidth and things like that. So if you're putting a recorder out in the middle of a forest in the Lake District, we're lucky to have 3G, and it's even that is spotty sometimes. So if you're trying to transmit high quality recordings, yeah. But no, the audio moth I think is plenty quality enough for general squirrel calls.
As you can say, you can put it out in poor quality, poor quality connection areas, and it will still work.
Yeah. As long as you do get some 3G, it does get spotty and get a few weeks behind sometimes.
Is there a maximum range that the audio technique can be used?
Yeah. It depends on a lot of things. Some of the red calls are very quiet, and so those calls are only really viable if you're using feeder and you know they're going to be, you know, within a few meters of your recorder, they're kind of those kind of quiet conversational calls between individuals obviously don't have to be loud. So if you've got a recorder 100 meters away, it's not going to have any chance of hearing it. The kind of alarm calls and calls that are designed to be loud and travel long distances, you can get a good distance out of, assuming that background noise and things like that aren't too high. So it depends on a lot of things, but the general rule is if you could hear it, the recorder will comfortably pick it up and it will show up in your analysis. So think of when you're walking around and you hear a grey squirrel or a crow or something, 100+ meters, you can probably hear that from, and the recorder will be the same.
Thanks, Will. Can the sex be identified from sound recordings? So is there a difference between male and female calls?
Not that we've seen. I've not got a license, so I can't be trapping to see about the individuals that we hear. One thing we're trying to work on, which will be interesting, but we haven't gotten very far down the line, is of having a weighing scale on the feeder where we'll pick up calls, so we can see if their kind of weight will in a lot of mammals, weight correlates with the fundamental frequency of your call. So the kind of that fundamental frequency, the larger the organism is, the lower the frequency is. If that relationship is the same in squirrels, it would be interesting, because then you would be able to get a body condition measurement from a good clear call. But that's just an idea more than anything we've explored, really.
Would your recordings delineate or define an area where grey squirrels are regularly occupying, so that it would be a choice spot to set up a trap or set up a hide?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So could your recordings be used to identify kind of areas where grey squirrels are occupying them, you know, quite frequently? So you could use that as a site to say, yes, we can put a trap here if we were going to do management work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you kind of we have set points on the site where we have our recorders at the moment, and the way we're operating at the moment is if I hear grey squirrel calls there regularly, or even just one, there is now someone on site who can go and kind of set up traps there and see if they can remove the grey from that area. So yeah, I think it's definitely, that's the kind of thing it'd be really useful for.
That's great, thank you. There was a question around where people can record sightings of reds and greys that can then be accessed and reviewed. I know, Louise, you highlighted the Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels website where people can record there, and they're doing their Great Scottish Squirrel Survey all through this week. So if you're in Scotland and you see a red or grey squirrel, please add to that excellent kind of annual surveying work. In England, you can use the Red Squirrels Northern England sightings page on their website. Northern Ireland, you can use, you go onto the Ulster Wildlife website and you can click through and record sightings. And it was asked, can the collected data then be accessed by groups? Most of them have dashboards that you can see some of the reported sightings, but then yes, they do link through, don't they, to the groups, and I know RSNE, the groups can access and see the data. I think it's the same with Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels. There's a kind of group area, isn't there, where they can access data, so they are linked to the groups, which is great.
There's also the Mammal Society's got an app called the Mammal Mapper, which I think is good for things like that, if you squirrels and other mammals.
Yes, yeah, which is another great app to use. So there's quite a few different things out there for being able to record, and I think they all kind of link into the local record centres, don't they, as well? So so I once saw quite a large grey squirrel running up and down the trunk of a larch, up quite high at a distance and making a screeching noise. What was this about, and what was the grey squirrel giving out a warning about? There'll have been something, maybe it didn't, maybe it was at you. I've had grey squirrels shouting at me once. I got too close. I don't know whether it had a nest but I remember it just being sat in the tree, kind of like screeching at me when I was in a woodland once, and there was nothing else around. So I'm assuming I was the issue, although I wasn't trying to do anything to the grey squirrel at the time. But like Will has said as well, that dogs and dog walking and things like that, they can quite screech at those, and it's a kind of a warning away and a warning to others, isn't it? I think. Well,
yeah, I think so. They can, sometimes, especially in kind of urban greys, they can get quite mouthy over nothing as well. Right.
So that's brilliant. Well, that's all of the questions. Thanks very much, everyone. Does anyone want to just have the speakers want to just say a last few words before I kind of wrap up, or?
No, just thank you for having me, and thanks for the great talks, guys. It was great.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. It's been a real, I mean, there's lots of, I always learn something new when people come and speak at these webinars. It's really great. So thanks to you all for joining us, and thanks to everyone for all their questions, and to the excellent speakers. I will put a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel where you can watch it again or share it, and where there are lots of other videos. But for now, I hope you enjoy the rest of Red Squirrel Awareness Week and you've enjoyed this fantastic webinar, and goodbye for now. Bye.